Altitude warning alarm screamed as Delta Flight 49 plunged toward the jagged Alaskan peaks. Panic tore through the cabin, yet an unassuming woman in seat 12B calmly unfastened her seatbelt. She stepped into the doomed cockpit, seized the radio, and spoke two words that made fighter jets freeze in the sky. To the boarding agents at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, she had been nothing more than another boarding pass scanned at the gate. To the exhausted flight attendant serving lukewarm ginger ale, she was simply the quiet woman sitting beside the window. According to the Delta Flight 49 passenger manifest, she was passenger 91. Sloan Whitaker pulled the hood of her oversized, faded gray sweatshirt farther over her head and rested her temple against the cool acrylic window. Behind dark polarized sunglasses, a vicious pattern of purple and yellow bruises spread across her left cheekbone. Her hands rested silently in her lap, their knuckles scraped raw and the broken skin healing in jagged lines. She looked like a woman who had survived a car accident, or perhaps a violent domestic dispute. The businessman in the tailored suit occupying seat 12A had glanced sideways at her during boarding, cleared his throat uneasily, and then spent the rest of the flight pretending she did not exist. That suited Sloan perfectly. Existing was something she was currently struggling to understand. Only recently, Major Sloan Whitaker of the United States Air Force had been strapped into the cockpit of a heavily modified F-35 Lightning II, operating under complete radio silence above the frozen, merciless waters of the Bering Sea. Her mission was so deeply classified that even her own wing commander in Nevada had not known her true coordinates. When a rogue, unmarked stealth drone locked its targeting lasers onto a military transport aircraft carrying 42 rescued Allied operatives, Sloan had not hesitated. She had no flares, no chaff, and no time. She drove her multi-million-dollar fighter directly into the drone's flight path, absorbing the catastrophic impact to shield the transport aircraft. Sloan ejected at Mach 1.2 into the sub-zero Arctic darkness. The military officially declared her killed in action. A classified recovery team later pulled her half-frozen body from the sea. To conceal her survival while intelligence agencies searched for the origin of the drone, they gave her a civilian passport, a disposable phone, and a commercial ticket to Anchorage. Now she was merely passenger 91, listening to the low, steady roar of the twin Pratt & Whitney engines as the Boeing 767 cruised at 35,000 feet. The cabin was a portrait of ordinary civilian calm. A toddler cried softly several rows ahead. The faint glow of the seatback screens washed the darkened fuselage in pale blue light. Sloan closed her eyes and tried to silence the phantom radar lock warnings still echoing inside her head. She focused instead on the slow, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping businessman beside her. Then the calm shattered. It did not begin with an explosion. It began with a horrifying metallic groan that vibrated through the floor. It was the sound of an aluminum skeleton collapsing beneath unimaginable pressure. A massive concussive blast followed. The entire aircraft shuddered violently, hurled upward as though struck by the hand of an enraged god, before snapping into a steep, stomach-churning bank to the left. The overhead compartments burst open, spilling heavy suitcases and backpacks onto the screaming passengers below. Explosive decompression. A blinding white fog instantly filled the cabin as the escaping pressurized air condensed. The temperature plunged to 30 degrees below zero within moments. Yellow oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like a canopy of dead spiders, swinging and tangling in the chaos. The businessman beside Sloan screamed and clawed blindly at the air while his oxygen mask swung just beyond his reach. The Boeing's nose pitched downward. The aircraft began diving toward the black, mountainous wilderness of Alaska. Gravitational force pinned the passengers against their seats as tearing metal and rushing wind roared through the fuselage like a hurricane. Sloan did not scream. While the civilians around her surrendered to primal terror, the part of her nervous system shaped by thousands of hours of combat training and life-or-death decisions shifted into cold, calculated overdrive. Her heart rate actually slowed. She reached upward, smoothly caught the swinging yellow mask, and secured it over her face. Then she seized the businessman's mask, forced it firmly over his mouth, and tightened the elastic strap against his panicked movements. "Breathe," she commanded. Her voice cut through the white fog with a sharp military authority that made the man freeze and obey. Sloan released her seatbelt. The aircraft was descending rapidly, far too rapidly. This was not the controlled emergency descent used by commercial pilots to reach breathable air. The angle of attack was completely wrong. The Boeing 767 shuddered violently, indicating that it was approaching an aerodynamic stall. The wings were buffeting. If the pilots did not recover almost immediately, the wings would fail structurally long before the aircraft reached the ground. Sloane stood, fighting the crushing force pushing her backward. The aisle had become a battlefield of fallen luggage and terrified passengers. At the front of the cabin, the heavy reinforced cockpit door had been warped by the violent pressure change and partially torn from its hinges. Through the narrow opening, Sloane heard the aircraft's automated warning system repeating its terrifying command. "Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up." There was no human response, no public announcement, no visible change in the control surfaces. Sloane did not think about her bruised ribs. She did not think about the classified orders requiring her to remain unnoticed. She did not think about being passenger 91. She was a combat pilot, and a dying aircraft was falling from the sky. Bracing herself against the seatbacks, Sloane fought her way along the steeply angled aisle, pulling herself forward one row at a time against the merciless force of gravity. Inside the cockpit of Delta Flight 49, she found a slaughterhouse of shattered glass and screaming wind, a massive piece of hail, or perhaps a fragment of the aircraft's damaged radome, had torn directly through the captain's windshield. The noise was apocalyptic. Captain Garrett Boone lay unconscious over the control column, a dark stream of blood freezing against his collar. His dead weight was forcing the yoke forward and making the dive even worse. In the right seat, First Officer Reed Lawson was barely 26 and completely unprepared for a catastrophic structural failure. I was crying in absolute terror. Reed pulled backward on his control column with all his strength, but the aircraft's control system resisted him, confused by the captain's body forcing the opposite controls forward. "Pull up! Pull up!" The automated warning continued without mercy. Suddenly, the cockpit door was kicked completely open. Reed gasped as a woman in a gray sweatshirt staggered onto the flight deck. Her sunglasses were gone, revealing her battered face and eyes as cold and sharp as crushed ice. "Get him off the yoke!" Sloane screamed over the deafening wind, pointing toward the unconscious captain. "Who are you?" Reed shouted back, his voice breaking with panic. "You can't be in here!" "I said get his weight off the yoke right now." Sloane did not wait for the paralyzed first officer to respond. She threw herself across the center console and grabbed Captain Boone by the shoulders of his uniform. Gritting her teeth against the unbearable pain in her fractured ribs, she dragged the heavy man backward, released his harness, and allowed him to collapse sideways out of the seat. Sloane slid into the captain's chair. She ignored the freezing wind tearing through the shattered windshield and locked both hands around the control column. "I have the aircraft," she stated. It was the standard aviation transfer of control, spoken with such absolute, unbreakable authority that Reed immediately released his own yoke. "You have the aircraft," he stammered automatically. "Disconnect the autopilot," Sloane ordered. She drove her thumb against the red disengagement button. The full weight and sluggishness of the Boeing 767 immediately flooded into her hands. It felt like steering a school bus through wet concrete. "Give me maximum thrust," she commanded. "We're going to recover gently. Do not overcorrect, or we'll tear the wings off." She tightened her grip. "Together, on 3, 1, 2, 3, pull." Sloane and Reed pulled back on the control columns. The enormous Boeing groaned. Its metal frame screamed in protest as Sloane aggressively exchanged airspeed for altitude, gradually flattening the dive. Beyond the shattered windshield, the jagged, snow-covered peaks of the Chugach Mountains passed less than 2,000 feet below them. Sloane leveled the aircraft at 12,000 feet, where the air was thick enough for the passengers to breathe without oxygen masks. "Reduce thrust to cruise. Run the emergency structural damage checklist." "The communication system is completely dead," Reed choked out. His hands shook violently as he moved between switches. "The primary radios are destroyed. The transponder isn't responding. Air traffic control can't see us. We're a ghost. Sloane's eyes swept across the shattered displays. She reached for the backup UHF radio and manually tuned it to 243.0 megahertz, the military emergency frequency. "Watch the horizon," she told Reed. "Keep the wings level. We're about to have company." She was right. 200 miles away at Elmendorf Air Force Base, alarms had sounded the moment Delta Flight 49 vanished from commercial radar and entered a steep, unexplained dive. NORAD identified the silent, plunging aircraft as a potential catastrophic hijacking. Almost immediately, 2 F-22 Raptors ignited their afterburners and tore through the frozen Alaskan sky at Mach 1.5. Captain Corbin Grip Maddox sat inside the lead F-22, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as he banked sharply above the mountain ranges. Beside him, his wingman, Lieutenant Rowan Viper Cade, maintained a flawless, tight formation. "Grip, I have visual," Viper's voice crackled across the encrypted tactical frequency. "Delta 767 at Angels 12. She's leveled out, but her flight path is unstable. The radome is severely damaged. The left cockpit windshield is gone." "Copy, Viper. Moving in for a visual inspection," Grip replied, his stomach tightening. A shattered cockpit at 35,000 feet usually meant the crew had died from hypoxia or exposure to the freezing air. Grip reduced his speed and guided the sleek, lethal fighter smoothly alongside the enormous commercial aircraft's left wing. He looked through his canopy and into the damaged flight deck of the Boeing. I expected to see something horrific. Instead, he saw a woman. She wore a civilian sweatshirt, and her hair whipped violently in the freezing wind. Both hands were locked around the control column as she wrestled with the sluggish aircraft, using the unmistakable muscular posture of a trained fighter pilot. A burst of static suddenly broke across Grip's military guard frequency. "Interceptor flight, this is Delta 49. A woman's voice echoed through his helmet. It was impossibly calm, measured, and completely free of civilian panic. It was the voice of someone accustomed to living inside the fire. "We have suffered a catastrophic forward structural failure. The captain is incapacitated, and the avionics are severely damaged, requesting an immediate vector to Elmendorf and an emergency runway." Grip blinked in disbelief. "Delta 49, this is Raptor 1. We receive you loud and clear. Be advised, you are entering restricted military airspace. Who is flying that aircraft?" Inside the freezing cockpit, Sloane looked through the damaged left windshield. The sleek gray body of the F-22 was so close that she could see her crippled aircraft reflected in the fighter pilot's helmet visor. For a fraction of a second, grief and exhaustion overwhelmed her. She wanted only to go home. She was not supposed to exist. But 200 people were sitting in the cabin behind her. She needed the fighters to clear the airspace and place emergency crews on the runway immediately. If she claimed to be an ordinary passenger flying the aircraft, officials would bury them beneath questions and procedures while the Boeing remained in the air. She needed immediate military compliance. Sloane wiped a streak of half-frozen blood from her bruised cheek and pressed the transmission switch on the yoke. "Raptor 1, she said, lowering her voice into a register of hardened, undeniable authority. "This is United States Air Force Major Sloane Whitaker, call sign Wraith." She stared through the damaged windshield. "Now clear a path to your runway before this aircraft tears herself apart." Inside the F-22, Grip's hand slipped from the throttle. His breath caught in his throat. Wraith. Every fighter pilot from Nellis to Elmendorf knew that name. The classified communication channels had been whispering about the ghost pilot who sacrificed herself over the Bering Sea to save 40 American lives. During a recent briefing, the base commander had called for a moment of silence for Major Whitaker. The officers had already raised their glasses in her memory. She was a legend, a martyr, and now she was sitting inside a damaged gray sweatshirt, wrestling a dying civilian airliner through the Alaskan sky. Grip stared across the narrow distance between the two aircraft. Through the shattered glass, the battered woman looked back at him. Their eyes met. A chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air traveled down Grip's spine. He did not request a verification code. He did not question the impossibility of what he was seeing. You do not question a ghost when she rises from the dead to fly again. Slowly and deliberately, Grip released the flight stick. He turned toward the Boeing, raised his hand to his helmet, and delivered a rigid, razor-sharp salute. "Copy that, Wraith." Grip replied, his voice thick with sudden reverence. "Welcome back to the land of the living. Raptor Flight is now your escort." He faced forward. "Follow me home." Silence filled the military guard frequency, broken only by the rhythmic roar of frozen wind tearing through Delta Flight 49's damaged cockpit. Sloan did not have the luxury of enjoying the F-22 pilot's respect. Her hands were cramping. The muscles in her forearms burned as she physically fought to keep the massive Boeing's nose level. "Raptor 1 to Elmendorf Tower," Grip transmitted. "Declare a full runway emergency. Delta 49 is coming in fast." He hesitated. "Pilot in command is Wraith Tower. Clear the airspace, clear the runway, get the foam trucks moving." Beside Sloan, First Officer Reed Lawson stared at her. His mind struggled to connect the bruised civilian woman in the gray sweatshirt with the legendary fighter pilot being treated like royalty by the interceptors outside. The force of Sloan's concentration dragged him back into the emergency. "Lawson!" she barked above the wind. "I need a damage report now. Read the master caution panel." Reed blinked and shook off his paralysis. He leaned over the center console and wiped the captain's blood from the primary flight display. "We have multiple cascading failures, ma'am. Hydraulic system A is losing pressure rapidly. The cabin is unpressurized but stable at 10,000 feet. The right engine is producing 60% thrust. Vibration warnings are active. The forward radome has suffered catastrophic structural loss." "We're losing hydraulic fluid," Sloan said, her eyes shifting between the instruments and the jagged Chugach horizon. "If System B fails, this control column becomes a brick, and we fall out of the sky. We need to put this aircraft on the ground very soon." "Elmendorf is 50 miles away on heading 290, Reed replied, his hands moving across the navigation panel. "But ma'am, the landing gear." Sloan looked down. The undercarriage indicator lights glowed an angry amber. "Lower it manually," she ordered. "Now." Reed pulled the alternate extension lever. A heavy mechanical impact echoed beneath the floor. The nose gear and left main landing gear indicators changed to solid, reassuring green. The right main gear remained amber. "The right main is jammed," Reed said, panic raising his voice. "The doors are open, but the strut won't lock. It's trapped between positions." He stared at the warning light. "If we land like this, the right wing will strike the runway and will cartwheel at 200 miles per hour. Sloan clenched her jaw. The searing pain in her fractured ribs pulsed with every beat of her heart. She remembered the Bering Sea. She remembered freezing water rushing into the canopy of her F-35. She had not survived the Arctic Ocean to die inside a burning aluminum coffin in Anchorage. "Raptor 1, Wraith," Sloan transmitted. "My right main landing gear is hung. I need a visual inspection." Outside the shattered window, Grip smoothly banked his F-22 and descended beneath the damaged airliner. "Wraith, Raptor 1, I have visual contact with the undercarriage. The right main is hanging at a 45-degree angle. It appears that a piece of torn fuselage is lodged inside the locking mechanism." "Understood," Sloan replied. Her mind raced through the physics of the Boeing airframe. They did not have enough altitude to dive and recover, using gravity to force the gear into position. She would have to use aerodynamic shear. "Lawson, tighten your harness. I'm going to slip the aircraft. I'll force the tail sideways and use the crosswind to drive the landing gear into the locked position." "In a 767? Reed gasped. "The airframe is already damaged. The sheer force could tear the wing apart." "It's either that or we become a fireball on runway 34, Sloan replied, her voice cold and leaving no room for debate. "Grip, move away. Give me space." Both F-22s immediately banked outward, creating a wide opening around the crippled airliner. Sloan took a deep breath, feeling the freezing air enter her aching lungs. She drove the left rudder pedal fully forward, while cross-controlling the yoke to the right. The enormous commercial aircraft groaned violently and began moving sideways through the air like a drifting race car. Aerodynamic pressure slammed into the right side of the fuselage. Metal screamed. In the cabin, passengers cried out as their restraints threw them sideways. The businessman from seat 12A, who had been praying, reached for the terrified teenager beside him and held the young passenger's hand for dear life. Bang! The sound echoed from beneath the right wing like a cannon shot. Sloan immediately centered the controls and fought the violently oscillating aircraft back into level flight. She looked toward the console. 3 solid green lights. The landing gear is down and locked, Reed breathed. Tears of complete relief streamed down his face. You did it. You actually did it. Don't celebrate yet, Sloan muttered, keeping her eyes on the damaged windshield. Beyond the broken glass, Elmendorf Air Force Base emerged from the snow-covered landscape. We still have to land a crippled aircraft on ice. The runway lights blazed through the fading light like a road made of fire. Along both sides of the 2-mile runway, dozens of emergency vehicles waited with flashing lights. Fire engines, ambulances, and armored military carriers painting the snow in pulses of red and blue. Elmendorf Tower, Delta 49, is on final approach, Sloan transmitted, her voice lowering into a slow, rhythmic cadence. We are landing heavy, reverse thrust is unavailable, and brake pressure is falling. Tell your fire crews to follow us down the runway. Copy that, Wraith. The runway belongs to you. Godspeed. The 2 F-22s flanking the airliner lowered their landing gear in solidarity and matched her descent foot by foot. It was the ultimate honor guard. 2 of the world's most advanced stealth fighters were guiding a battered, dying civilian aircraft back to Earth. 50-40-30, the ground proximity warning system announced. Hold steady, Sloan whispered, speaking more to herself than to Reed. The control column fought against her. The damaged right engine sputtered and surged. A brutal crosswind swept across the runway, attempting to force the nose away from the centerline. 20-10. Sloan pulled back on the control column with the last of her strength and flared the massive aircraft. The rear wheels struck the concrete with bone-shattering force. The right landing gear, weakened by the obstruction and the violent aerodynamic slip, screamed in protest and threw a massive trail of orange sparks across the runway. Sloan forced the nose gear onto the ground and stood on the rudder pedals, fighting the aircraft's desperate attempt to veer into the snowbanks. "Maximum braking!" she shouted. "Give me everything!" Reed slammed both feet against the brakes. The smell of vaporized rubber and burning brake pads flooded the cockpit. The Boeing shuddered violently. One tire after another exploded beneath the intense friction. The exposed metal rims scraped against the concrete, carving deep trenches into the runway. Outside, the fire engines accelerated and chased the screaming airliner as it lost speed. 150 knots, 100 knots, 50 knots. With one final, agonizing groan of twisted metal, Delta Flight 49 ground to a brutal, trembling stop. Silence filled the cockpit. Only the hiss of escaping oxygen and the distant wail of approaching sirens remained. Sloan sat frozen in the captain's seat, her chest rising and falling. Her hands were still wrapped around the control column, trembling uncontrollably. She closed her eyes and allowed the truth to wash over her. They were on the ground. They were alive. "Evacuation checklist," she whispered, her voice finally breaking beneath the exhaustion. "Deploy the slides. Get everyone out." As Reed rushed to activate the emergency exits, Sloan released the captain's harness. She stood, her legs feeling as heavy as lead, and looked through the shattered windshield. The 2 F-22s had landed gracefully on the parallel runway. Through the canopy of the lead fighter, Grip raised one hand in a silent final salute. Sloan answered with a slow, exhausted nod. The reinforced cockpit door swung fully open. General Thaddeus Pike entered the galley outside the flight deck, wearing a dark winter coat and accompanied by 2 heavily armed Air Force Special Operations sentries. "Major Whitaker," General Pike said quietly as he stepped over the debris. He did not stare at her battered face. He did not look at her civilian clothes. He regarded her with the deep, unwavering respect of a commanding officer witnessing a miracle. "Your transport is waiting. It's time for you to disappear again." Sloan looked back toward the cabin. The emergency slides had deployed. Passengers screamed as they slid into the freezing Alaskan darkness and ran toward the waiting fire crews. The businessman from seat 12A carried the crying toddler Sloan had noticed earlier. None of them looked back toward the cockpit. None of them knew the name Wraith. None of them knew about the impossible sacrifice made by the woman who had brought them home. "Yes, sir," Sloan replied quietly. She pulled the hood of her faded gray sweatshirt over her bruised head, hiding her face in shadow. Slipping past the stunned First Officer Lawson, she climbed down the forward service ladder, stepped away from the broken aircraft, and disappeared into a waiting black government SUV before the civilian emergency crews reached the nose gear. The media would call it a miracle. The passengers would describe the first officer who had saved their lives. The airline would release public statements filled with relief. But above the Alaskan mountains, across the encrypted frequencies of the United States Air Force, the legend of Wraith would live forever. The ghost who refused to die. The hero who hid in plain sight as Passenger 91. True heroes do not wait for the spotlight. They step into the fire when the world needs them most, then disappear into the shadows once the job is done. Major Sloan Whitaker's impossible journey, from a classified death notice to the savior of Delta Flight 49, proved that legends are forged in the quietest moments of absolute courage. If this incredible story of resilience and hidden bravery moved you, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more extraordinary real-life stories.